Widow's daughter heals cowboy, not knowing he will repay her with love. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Sarah found him. She had been walking the fence line like she did most mornings, checking for breaks in the wood where the cattle might slip through. The land her mother owned was small, barely enough to call a ranch, but it was theirs. Her father had died 3 winters past, leaving them with dry soil, a handful of livestock, and silence that stretched wider than the prairie itself. Sarah had learned to live in that silence. She had learned to wake before dawn, to mend what was broken, to carry water from the creek when the well ran low. She had learned that survival in the West meant keeping your head down and your hands busy. But that morning, the silence broke. She saw him from a distance first, a dark shape crumpled near the cottonwood tree that marked the edge of their property. At first, she thought it was a coyote, or maybe a calf that had wandered too far. But as she got closer, she saw the boots, the torn shirt, the blood. He was a man, a cowboy, maybe, or a drifter. His hat lay a few feet away, half buried in the dust. His face was turned toward the sky, pale and still, and for a moment Sarah thought he was dead. Then his chest moved. It was a small movement, barely there, but it was enough. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, unsure where to touch, where to help. His shirt was soaked through with blood, dark and sticky, and there was a wound in his side that looked like it had been torn open by something sharp. A knife, maybe, or worse. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. But his right hand was clenched tight around something small and silver. A locket. Even unconscious, even bleeding out into the dirt, he held on to it like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should run back to the house, get her mother, get help. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his fingers gripped that locket. Maybe it was the deep lines of pain carved into his face, even in unconsciousness. Maybe it was just the fact that out here, in this endless stretch of land, people didn't last long if you left them behind. She made a choice. "Hold on," she whispered, even though she didn't know if he could hear her. "Just hold on." She ran. Her mother was in the kitchen when Sarah burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed. "There's a man," Sarah said, the words tumbling out fast. "Out by the cottonwood. He's hurt bad, Mama. He's bleeding." Her mother, Ruth, turned from the stove, her face going hard in that way it always did when danger was near. She was a widow, and widows in the West learned quickly that men could bring trouble as easily as they brought help. "What kind of man?" Ruth asked, her voice sharp. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But he's dying." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, her jaw tight. "Sarah, we don't know him. We don't know what he's done or who's looking for him. If we bring him in here, he'll die if we don't." The 2 women stood there in the small kitchen, the morning light slanting through the window, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Ruth had raised her daughter to be careful, to be smart, to protect herself in a world that didn't care much for women alone. But she had also raised her to be kind. Ruth sighed. "Get the wagon." They brought him inside together, struggling under his weight. He was tall, broad-shouldered despite the thinness that came from too many days without food. His clothes were worn and dusty, the kind a man wore when he'd been riding for a long time with no place to call home. They laid him on the narrow bed in the back room, the one that used to be Sarah's father's. Ruth moved fast, peeling away his shirt, her hands steady even as her face remained tight with worry. Sarah fetched water, clean rags, the bottle of whiskey they kept for wounds. The gash in his side was deep, but not fatal, not if they could stop the bleeding. Ruth worked in silence, her movements practiced and sure. She had patched up her husband more than once, back when he was still alive. She knew how to clean a wound, how to stitch skin back together, how to keep a man breathing when his body wanted to give up. Sarah stayed close, handing her mother whatever she needed, watching the stranger's face for any sign of waking. But he didn't wake. He just lay there, his breathing rough and uneven, his hand still clutching that locket even as they moved him, even as Ruth pulled thread through his skin. "Who do you think he is?" Sarah asked quietly. Ruth didn't look up. Doesn't matter who he is. Matters what he's running from. Sarah's eyes drifted to the locket in his hand. It was small, silver, old. The kind of thing a man carried when he had something or someone to remember. Maybe he's not running, Sarah said softly. Maybe he's just lost. Ruth tied off the last stitch and sat back, wiping her hands. Men like this don't get lost by accident, Sarah. They get lost because they're trying to disappear. Sarah didn't argue, but she also didn't look away from the stranger's face. There was something in it, something beneath the dirt and the blood and the pain, that didn't look like a man who wanted to hurt anyone. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. He didn't wake that day, or the next. Sarah checked on him every few hours, changing the bandages, bringing water, even though he couldn't drink it. She watched his chest rise and fall, listened to the ragged sound of his breathing, and wondered what kind of life had brought him to this place. On the third morning, she was sitting beside the bed when his eyes opened. They were gray, the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and they were filled with pain. He blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused, and then his eyes found hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah didn't know what to say. She didn't know if he would thank her, or curse her, or try to leave. But he didn't do any of those things. He just looked at her, his gray eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. Then his gaze dropped to his hand, still clutching the locket, and something broke in his expression, something quiet and deep. He didn't say a word. But Sarah understood. This man was carrying more than a wound in his side. He was carrying a past he couldn't let go of, even as it bled him dry. The first word he spoke was her name. It came on the fifth day, when Sarah was changing the bandage on his side. Her hands were steady, practiced now from days of tending to him, but she was careful not to press too hard. The wound was healing slowly, the edges knitting together the way her mother had taught her. But healing took time. And time, Sarah was learning, could be a quiet kind of torture. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She looked up, startled. His gray eyes were watching her, clearer now than they had been before. There was still pain in them, but something else too, something that made her chest tighten. "How do you know my name?" she asked softly. "I heard your mother say it," he replied. His voice was low, almost a whisper, like speaking took effort. "When you brought me in." Sarah nodded slowly, her hands still resting on the clean bandage. "What's yours?" He hesitated. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he did. "Caleb." The name hung in the air between them, simple and plain. But the way he said it, the weight behind it, made it sound like a confession. "Caleb," Sarah repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It suited him, she thought. Strong but worn, like something that had been used too much and needed rest. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with that same heavy sadness she had seen when he first woke. Then he turned his face away, toward the window where the morning light was pouring in, and closed his eyes. Sarah finished wrapping the bandage in silence. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Caleb grew stronger, bit by bit. By the end of the first week, he could sit up without wincing. By the second, he could stand, though he still held his side like the wound was a reminder of something deeper. Sarah brought him food, biscuits and stew, whatever her mother made, and he ate without complaint, though he never asked for more. He didn't talk much. Most days, he barely spoke at all. But Sarah noticed things. She noticed the way his hands trembled when he held a cup of water, like he wasn't used to someone handing him anything without expecting something in return. She noticed the way he watched the door, always aware of who was coming and going, like a man who had learned not to trust stillness. And she noticed the locket, still tucked inside his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He never took it out, never opened it, but his hand drifted to it sometimes, when he thought no one was looking. Sarah wanted to ask about it. She wanted to know who was inside, who he was carrying with him like a ghost he couldn't bury. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, the kind of look that said some questions didn't have answers you wanted to hear. So, instead, she asked simpler things. "Where are you from?" "Nowhere that matters." Where were you going? Don't know. What happened to you? Out there, I mean. Who hurt you? At that he looked at her, and his eyes were so full of pain that Sarah almost wished she hadn't asked. I did, he said quietly. I hurt myself. She didn't understand what he meant. But she didn't push. She just nodded and left the room, her heart heavier than it had been before. By the third week, Caleb was strong enough to walk outside. Ruth didn't like it. She still didn't trust him, still watched him like he was a rattlesnake coiled in the corner. But she also couldn't deny that he had been nothing but quiet and respectful since he'd been under their roof. And when he offered to help with the work, mending the fence posts that had rotted through, hauling water from the creek, feeding the horses in the small stable, Ruth didn't say no. They needed the help. And Caleb, Sarah realized, needed something to do. She watched him from the porch as he worked in the yard, his movements careful but steady. He was still healing, still favoring his left side, but he didn't complain. He just worked, his hands moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from a life spent surviving. He was a cowboy, Sarah thought. Or he had been, once. The way he handled the horses, the way he moved through the land like it was familiar, it all spoke of a man who had lived under open skies, who knew what it meant to ride hard and sleep light. But there was something broken in him too. Something that made him flinch when she got too close, when she handed him a tool or thanked him for his work. It was like kindness was a language he didn't speak anymore. Like he didn't believe he deserved it. One afternoon, Sarah brought him water while he was hammering a new post into the ground. The sun was high, the heat pressing down on them like a weight, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. Here, she said, holding out the tin cup. He looked at it, then at her, and for a moment he didn't move. Then he took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, and something passed between them, something too fragile to name. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. Sarah nodded. You don't have to keep working so hard. You're still healing. I owe you, he said simply. Your mother. You. I owe you. You don't owe us anything. But even as she said it, she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darkened. He didn't believe her. He thought everything had a price, even mercy. Yes, I do, he said quietly. Then he turned back to the fence, driving the hammer down hard, like he could bury the dead in the wood. Sarah walked back to the house, her chest aching in a way she didn't understand. That night, Sarah sat on the porch while the sky turned purple and the stars began to prick through the darkness. The air was cooler now, carrying the smell of dust and sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. Caleb was sitting on the steps below her, his arms resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had been quiet all evening, even quieter than usual, and Sarah could feel the weight of whatever he was carrying pressing down on him like stones. Caleb, she said softly. He didn't turn, but she knew he was listening. You don't have to tell me, she continued, her voice careful. About where you came from, about what happened. But I want you to know you're safe here. Whatever you're running from, whatever you did, it doesn't matter to me. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and wide, and Sarah thought maybe she had said too much. Maybe she had crossed a line he didn't want crossed. But then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. It should matter, he said. What I did, who I was, it should matter. Sarah's throat tightened. Why? He turned then, just enough that she could see the side of his face in the fading light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were filled with something that looked like shame. Because I'm not a good man, Sarah, he said. And the longer I stay here, the more you're going to see that. Her heart broke a little, hearing him say it. Not because she believed him, but because he did. I don't think that's true, she said softly. He shook his head, a bitter smile pulling at his lips. You don't know me. Maybe not, she admitted. But I know what I see. And I see someone who's trying. Caleb looked away, back toward the horizon, and the silence returned. But this time, it felt different. Less heavy. Like something had shifted between them, even if just a little. Sarah stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. Good night, Caleb. He didn't respond, but she felt his eyes on her as she walked back inside. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next. Caleb worked the land like a man trying to earn forgiveness from the dirt itself. He mended what was broken, carried what was heavy, and spoke only when necessary. But Sarah watched him. She watched the way his hands stilled sometimes, mid-task, like he was remembering something he couldn't escape. She watched the way he touched the locket in his pocket when he thought no one was looking. And she watched the way he looked at her, like she was something good he didn't deserve to be near. It scared her a little, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was starting to care. And caring for a man who believed he was beyond saving felt like reaching for something just out of reach. Something that might disappear the moment she got close. But she couldn't stop herself, because beneath the silence, beneath the guilt and the shame, she saw something else in Caleb. She saw a man who had been hurt so deeply that he didn't know how to let himself heal. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to help him. Even if he didn't believe he could be helped. The writer came on a Tuesday morning, when the sun was still low and the shadows stretched long across the prairie. Sarah saw him first, a dark shape moving against the horizon, dust rising behind his horse like smoke. She was hanging laundry on the line, her hands full of wet cloth, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him. Riders didn't come to their land often, and when they did, it was rarely for good reasons. She called for Caleb, who was in the stable brushing down one of the horses. He came out quickly, his eyes already scanning the distance, his body going still in that way it did when danger was near. The rider came closer, and Sarah could see him more clearly now. He was older, maybe 50, with a hard face and a gun strapped to his hip. His clothes were worn but clean, the kind a man wore when he'd been traveling for a long time with purpose. And his eyes, even from a distance, Sarah could see the coldness in them. Caleb's hand moved to his side, where his own gun would have been if he still carried one. But he didn't. He had left his gun in the bottom of his saddlebag weeks ago, like he was trying to leave that part of himself behind. "Go inside," Caleb said, his voice low. "What?" Sarah turned to him, confused. "Go inside, Sarah. Please." There was something in his tone that made her afraid. Not of a rider, but of what was about to happen. She wanted to argue to stay, but the look in Caleb's eyes stopped her. So she went, but she didn't go far. She stood just inside the doorway, watching through the crack in the door, her heart pounding. The rider stopped his horse a few yards from where Caleb stood. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just looked at each other, the silence between them heavy and dangerous. Then the rider dismounted, slow and deliberate, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Caleb Hayes," the man said, his voice rough and bitter. "Didn't think I'd find you hiding out on a widow's ranch, playing farmhand." Caleb didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding, Garrett." "No." The man, Garrett, smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then what do you call this? Redemption? You think working some land and keeping your head down makes up for what you did?" Sarah's breath caught. She pressed closer to the door, her hands gripping the frame. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it was bad. She knew that whatever Caleb had been running from had finally caught up to him. "I'm not looking for redemption," Caleb said quietly. "I know I can't make up for it." "Damn right you can't." Garrett took a step forward, his hand still on his gun. "She's dead because of you, Caleb. Emma's dead because you were too busy being an outlaw to protect her." The name hung in the air like a gunshot. Emma. Sarah's chest tightened. She thought of a locket, the one Caleb carried like it was the only thing keeping him alive. She understood now. The woman inside, Emma, she had been his. And she was gone. "I know," Caleb said, and his voice broke just a little. "I know she's dead. I think about it every day." "Good," Garrett spat. You should carry that weight until it crushes you." "I do." Garrett stared at him, his jaw working, his eyes filled with rage and grief. Sarah realized then that this man had known Emma too. Maybe he had loved her. Maybe he had blamed Caleb for her death every day since it happened. "I should kill you," Garrett said, his voice shaking. Right here. Right now. For what you did. Caleb didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have. He just stood there, his hands at his sides, his eyes meeting Garrett's without flinching. If that's what you need to do, Caleb said quietly, then do it. The words sent a chill through Sarah. She wanted to scream, to run out there and stop this, but her feet wouldn't move. She could only watch, her heart breaking, as Caleb stood in front of a man who wanted him dead and didn't fight back. Garrett's hand tightened on his gun. His breathing was harsh, uneven. For a moment, Sarah thought he would do it. She thought she would watch Caleb die right there in the dust, and there would be nothing she could do to stop it. But then Garrett let go of his gun. His hand fell to his side, and he took a step back, shaking his head. "You're not worth it," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "You're already dead, Caleb. You're just too much of a coward to admit it." Caleb said nothing. He just stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Garrett mounted his horse, yanking the reins hard. He looked down at Caleb one last time, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and final. "If I ever see you again, I won't walk away. You hear me? Next time, I'll finish it." Then he rode off, leaving nothing behind but dust and silence. Sarah ran to Caleb the moment Garrett was out of sight. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She just ran, her feet carrying her across the yard until she was standing in front of him, her hands reaching for his arms. "Caleb," she said, her voice shaking. "Caleb, are you?" "Don't," he said, pulling away from her. His voice was sharp, defensive. "Don't, Sarah." "Don't what?" she demanded, her fear turning to anger. "Don't care? Don't ask what just happened? You stood there and let that man threaten to kill you, and you didn't even defend yourself." "There's nothing to defend," Caleb said bitterly. He turned away from her, his shoulders tight, his hands clenched into fists. "He's right. Everything he said, he's right." "No, he's not. You don't know what I did." His voice cracked, and he pressed a hand to his face, like he could hold himself together through sheer will. "You don't know who I was." "Then tell me," Sarah said. She moved in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Tell me, Caleb. Tell me who you were." He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made her chest ache. "I was an outlaw," he said, the words coming out slow and heavy. "I robbed banks, stagecoaches, anyone who had something worth taking. I rode with a gang, lived by the gun, and didn't care who got hurt along the way." He paused, his voice breaking. "And there was a woman, Emma. She loved me, even though she shouldn't have. Even though I didn't deserve it. And I promised her I'd leave that life behind. I promised her I'd keep her safe." Sarah's throat tightened. "What happened?" Caleb's hand drifted to the locket in his pocket, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "One of the men I rode with, he came looking for me. Said I owed him money, owed him loyalty. I told him I was done, that I wasn't going back. But he didn't care. Caleb stopped, his jaw clenching. "He hurt her. Killed her. Just to punish me. And I wasn't there. I couldn't stop it." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "I don't deserve your kindness, Sarah," he said. "I don't deserve any of this. And the longer I stay here, the more I put you and your mother in danger. Garrett won't be the last. There are others out there who want me dead. And they won't care who's standing next to me when they come. So you're just going to leave?" Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. "You're going to run again?" "It's what I do," he said, his voice hollow. "It's all I know." "No." Sarah stepped closer, her hands shaking. "No, Caleb. You're wrong." He looked at her, his eyes full of disbelief. "You think the past owns you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You think because you made mistakes, because someone you loved got hurt, that you don't deserve to be forgiven. But that's not how it works. Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you accept. Sarah, listen to me." She reached up, her hand touching his cheek, and he froze. "You're not that man anymore. I see you, Caleb. I see the way you work this land, the way you help my mother, the way you try so hard to be good even when you don't believe you can be. That's who you are now. Not the outlaw. Not the man who failed. You." His eyes glistened, And for the first time since she'd met him, Sarah saw tears. "I don't know how to let it go," he whispered. "Then let me help you," she said. "Let me show you that you're worth saving." They stood there beneath the cottonwood tree, the wind moving through the branches above them, and something passed between them, something fragile and new and terrifying. Caleb's hand came up slowly, covering hers where it rested against his cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, like he was afraid she might disappear. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice breaking. "Maybe not," Sarah said softly. "But I'm here anyway." And for the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry his guilt alone. The days after Garrett rode away were strange and quiet. Caleb didn't leave. Sarah had been afraid he would, that she'd wake one morning to find him gone, nothing left behind but the empty space where he'd been. But he stayed. He worked the land like always, mended the fences, fed the horses, helped Ruth with whatever needed doing. But there was something different about him now. Something lighter, like a weight he'd been carrying for years, had shifted just enough that he could breathe again. Sarah watched him from the porch in the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and red. He would stand by the stable, his hands resting on the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and she wondered what he was thinking, if he was still fighting the urge to run, or if maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to stay. She wanted to ask him, but she was afraid of the answer. So, instead, she waited and hoped. It was a week later when the second rider came. This time, Sarah wasn't surprised. She had been expecting it, in the way you expect a storm when the sky turns dark and the air goes still. She had known that Garrett wouldn't be the last, that Caleb's past was still out there, still hunting him, and sooner or later it would find him again. But what she hadn't expected was the way Caleb faced it. The rider appeared at midday, when the sun was high and merciless. Sarah was in the garden pulling weeds, and Caleb was in the yard, shoeing one of the horses. He looked up at the sound of hooves, and his whole body went still. The man who rode toward them was younger than Garrett, maybe 30, with a cruel face and a gun slung low on his hip. He wore a black hat pulled down over his eyes, and there was something cold and calculating in the way he moved. Sarah's heart pounded. She dropped the weeds in her hand and stood, wiping her dirt-stained fingers on her apron. She wanted to run to Caleb, to stand between him and this stranger, but her feet wouldn't move. The rider stopped a few yards away and dismounted slowly, his eyes locked on Caleb. Well, the man said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Caleb Hayes. Heard you were dead." "Not yet," Caleb said quietly. He set down the horseshoe and stood, his hands loose at his sides. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't move toward the stable where his gun was hidden. He just stood there, calm and steady, and waited. The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You remember me, Caleb?" "I do." "Good." The man took a step forward. "Then you remember what you owe me." Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't know what this man was talking about, but she could see the tension in Caleb's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. "I remember," Caleb said. "And you're right. I owe you." The stranger's smile widened. "So you're not going to run this time? Not going to hide behind some widow's skirts?" Sarah flinched at the cruelty in his words, but Caleb didn't react. He just looked at the man, his gray eyes steady and clear. "No," Caleb said. "I'm not going to run." The stranger laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the yard. "You think you're brave now? You think standing here makes up for what you did? You stole from me, Caleb. You and your gang robbed me blind and left me for dead in the middle of nowhere. And now you're playing rancher like none of it ever happened." "It happened," Caleb said quietly. "I know it did. And I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, simple and stark. The stranger stopped laughing. His expression darkened, and his hand moved toward his gun. "Sorry doesn't bring back what I lost." "No," Caleb agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing I say or do will change what happened. But I'm still sorry. And if you came here to kill me, then do it. I won't stop you." Sarah's breath caught. She took a step forward, her mouth opening to shout, to beg, to do something. But Caleb's voice stopped her. "But if you kill me," Caleb continued, his voice calm and measured, "it won't bring you peace. It won't undo what happened. It'll just make you the same kind of man I used to be. And I don't think that's what you want." The stranger stared at him, his hand still on his gun. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dry grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then, slowly, the stranger's hand fell away from his gun. "You're right," he said, his voice rough. "Killing you won't fix anything." He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "But I hope you live with it, Caleb. I hope every day you wake up and remember what you did." "I do," Caleb said softly. "Every day." The stranger turned and mounted his horse. He looked down at Caleb one last time, and when he spoke, his voice was tired. "You're not worth the bullet." Then he rode away, leaving nothing but dust and silence behind. Sarah ran to Caleb the moment the rider was out of sight. She didn't care about propriety or caution or fear. She just ran, her skirts tangling around her legs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break. "Caleb," she gasped, grabbing his arms. "Are you?" "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was steady. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something different, something new. He looked free. "You didn't fight him," she said, her voice shaking. "You just stood there and let him." "I told him the truth," Caleb said simply. "That's all I could do." Sarah stared at him, tears blurring her vision. "You could have died." "Maybe," he admitted. "But I'm tired of running, Sarah. I'm tired of hiding from what I did. If I'd run again, I'd be running for the rest of my life. And I don't want that anymore." "What do you want?" she whispered. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the weight of everything unsaid passed between them. "I want to stay," he said quietly. "If you'll let me." Sarah's breath hitched. She wanted to say yes, to throw her arms around him and never let go. But there was something else she needed to know first. "What about Emma?" she asked softly. "What about the locket?" Caleb's hand drifted to his pocket, where the locket still rested against his heart. He pulled it out slowly, holding it in his palm like it was the most fragile thing in the world. "Emma was good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved me when I didn't deserve it. And I failed her. I'll carry that for the rest of my life." He paused, his thumb brushing over the silver surface. "But I think she'd want me to let go, to stop punishing myself, to live." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Then let go." Caleb looked at her, his eyes glistening. Then he walked to the cottonwood tree, the one where Sarah had found him all those weeks ago, bleeding and broken. He knelt down in the dirt and began to dig with his bare hands, carving out a small hole in the earth. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, as he placed the locket in the ground and covered it over. He stayed there for a moment, his head bowed, his hands resting on the disturbed soil. And then he stood, brushing the dirt from his palms, and turned back to her. "It's done," he said softly. Sarah crossed the distance between them and took his hands in hers. They were rough and calloused, the hands of a man who had known violence and hardship and pain. But they were also gentle, steady, real. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "If you'll have me," he said. "I will." The days that followed were not perfect. Caleb still woke some nights with nightmares, still carried the scars of his past in his eyes and on his skin. But he stayed. He worked the land with Ruth, helped build a new chicken coop, taught Sarah how to break a stubborn horse. And slowly, day by day, he learned how to live without running. Ruth warmed to him eventually, seeing the way he looked at her daughter, the way he showed up every morning ready to work, the way he never once asked for anything in return. She didn't say much. Ruth wasn't one for words. But one evening she handed him a cup of coffee and said, "You're good for her." Caleb had nodded, his throat tight, and said, "I'll try to be." And Sarah watched him become something she'd never thought possible. Not a cowboy trying to outrun his past, but a man learning to build a future. He smiled more, laughed sometimes when she teased him, let himself be cared for without flinching. One evening, As the sun set and painted the sky in gold and crimson, they sat together beneath the cottonwood tree. Sarah's head rested on his shoulder, and his arm was around her, holding her close. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, and his voice was sure. "Not anymore." "Why not?" He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft and warm in the fading light. "Because I finally found something worth staying for." Sarah smiled, tears pricking her eyes. She reached up and touched his face, and he leaned into her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I love you," she said. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with everything he couldn't say. But he didn't need to say it. She already knew. "I love you too," he whispered. And beneath the cottonwood tree, where he had once buried his past, Caleb Hayes allowed himself to believe in tomorrow.